I am thrilled to share today's interview with Constanza Eliana. I met Eliana in 2018 while I was leading an online dismantling racism course. And Eliana is also one of the facilitators for the Healing and Community Retreat, which will take place in June of 2020 in Asheville, North Carolina. In this interview, we discussed what it means to decolonize the wellness industry. We shared and talked about the relationship between joy and grief. And Eliana talked about what it means to come back into wholeness instead of distracting from grief that needs to be processed. Constanza Eliana Chinea is a Latinx certified yoga instructor who has a total of 10 years experience in the industry and over 300 hours of training in yoga, trauma, and anti-racism. She began teaching and consulting after noticing a need for diversity and representation in the industry. She now teaches yogis and entrepreneurs how to decolonize their practice, create equity for teachers of color, and build inclusive spaces in the community. Constanza Eliana has been featured in Voyage LA magazine and the Rising Woman Project. She is the creator of trainings like Embody Inclusivity and Unpacking Spiritual Bypass, and is the host of WOC Spill the Tea, a women of color panel discussing politics, social justice, and anti-racism. She began her yoga journey in 2009 by working for studios where she could not afford to practice and became a yoga instructor in 2013. She noticed quickly that studios and teachers were not practicing what they were preaching and that simple mindset shifts could make all the difference. Her instruction became more refined and social justice became her focus. She began consulting in 2019. I hope you enjoy the interview. Hi, Constanza Eliana.
Hello.
It's good to see you. Nice to see you.
Yes, you too. Thanks for inviting me.
So you are one of the facilitators for the in-person Healing and Community Retreat, which will take place in June in North Carolina. And I appreciate you saying yes to collaborating on this retreat and saying yes to being interviewed for this summit. So thanks for being a yes.
Yeah, thank you. This is feels really important to do. So I was very happy to be invited and of course to support your work.
So I would love, before we dive into the conversation, I would love for you to lead a grounding practice for us, just to connect and center.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So the type of practice that I do is rooted in Vedanta philosophy. I studied through the Shivananda lineage, so the grounding will be very much related to that lineage and that practice. So I will just invite us and everyone watching to find either a comfortable seat or to lay back. Comfortable seat can be on your chair, or it can be cross-legged on the floor on your yoga mat, or you could literally just be laying down. And just allow your shoulders to kind of drop. So if you want to do a little bit of shoulder movement, like bring the shoulders up towards the ears, back and down, feel free. Or you can just simply relax the shoulders from the neck area. And allow your hands and your arms to just fully relax. And this will be just a really quick grounding into the physical body and how perhaps emotions can manifest into the physical. So whether you're already relaxed or you're feeling anxious or there's some frustration or sadness or challenge, internal challenge happening, or even if you're joyful or excited, just start to notice how that might feel and manifest in the physical body. You might be in anticipation for this video or this process, so in this conversation, so just notice if that is also coming up as well. And as you gradually start to drop in, letting your shoulders relax, your arms and your hands relax, allowing your eyes to close if they aren't already, if you feel safe to do so. Just start to notice your natural breath. Just the inhale and the exhale. Try not to change it or manipulate it or make it different. Just notice how it feels to be breathing. And then as you continue noticing the breath, the inhale and the exhale, notice if there's any part of your body that is feeling sensationally how you are emotionally feeling. So if you're anxious or you're in anticipation, you might literally be at the edge of your seat, or you might notice a little tension through the low belly or even through the shoulders and the neck. And if you're excited, you might feel really jittery, like there's a lot of aliveness in the body, so there's a lot of movement in the body. So literally just start noticing what is physically coming up for you. And then from here, we'll just take a couple deep rounds of breath to just center ourselves a little bit more into this moment, and then perhaps start to shift that energy towards either more calm if that's what's necessary, or alertness or focus. So together we'll take a deep breath in through the nose. Maybe hold it a little bit at the top for a second and then exhale through the nose. And a few more times. Inhale through the nose, maybe a little bit slower and deeper this time. Hold a little bit at the top and then exhale through the nose. Maybe even longer exhale this time. Maybe 2 more times like this. Inhale. And exhale. And maybe even slower than that for this last one. Inhale. And exhale. And you'll come back to a natural breath, still keeping the energy of that controlled breath that we just did. Feeling yourself firmly planted on whatever it is that you're sitting or laying on, whether it's a bed or a mat or the floor or a cushion. And then gradually coming back into the space before opening the eyes, just bringing ourselves back into the space with our auditory system, just listening to the sounds in the space, listening to my voice, sensing, feeling, touching, cool air, warm air, whatever it is that you're feeling. Maybe a sense of smell or taste is coming up, kind of waking you back into the moment, into your environment. And then when you're ready, you can start to gradually open the eyes, maybe fluttering them or maybe just looking down for a second. And then coming back into the space with us.
Thank you so much. That felt like such a gift. Thank you for leading. Constanza Eliana, I would love for you to share some about the work you do in the world.
The work that I do is predominantly about decolonization that leads towards liberation. And this is work that I have personally been doing for myself for the last couple years. As a Puerto Rican woman, where my country is currently under U.S. colonization. My parents moved me from Puerto Rico to the United States when I was very young, so I had to learn two cultures at the same time. And so, assimilation was something that I went through as a survival tactic so that, the kids at school in the Midwest where I was now living at 8 years old, um, they wouldn't bully me for, eating arroz con gandules, and they wouldn't bully me for my curly hair. So I started straightening my hair. And so, and I took out the accent in my speech. So assimilation was something that happened to me through that colonization process. I very vividly remember when I was younger that sense of understanding that, like, oh, I'm not like everybody else and I am not considered normal, therefore there's something wrong with me. And so that as a child was really traumatizing. So the process for me of decolonization for the last couple of years has led me to doing work with other people, utilizing anti-racism as a foundational tool just for my own understanding. I came into anti-racism as a way to give myself language for what was happening to me, and to also understand the oppression that I was facing even within the yoga studio. I've been in the yoga industry for about 10 years in many different roles, not just a yoga teacher. And so I didn't necessarily understand or have a language of, like, well, what is this? And now I understand that what a microaggression is. So I can really pinpoint when that's happening to me, versus before I thought I was just crazy, right? Or I thought, oh, I need to cut somebody some slack because maybe they don't talk like this to everybody, or maybe I said something that offended them. But, my anti-racism training with you and some others have really taught me this foundational basic framework of, like, how white supremacy actually operates and how dominant culture operates, and how I chose as a child to assimilate and to really erase a lot of myself and what made me unique and special. I erased all of that so I could be part of the crowd. And so the work that I've stepped into is, utilizing yogic philosophy, which I love, and anti-racism as the foundational sense of understanding and education, and merging the two together to have a true sense of what will liberation look like from individual to individual based on their lived experience. And then also collective liberation. What will that look like? Because I don't necessarily believe that white people are also liberated. I think that the oppression that they inflict on others is a direct link to their own trauma from their own ancestry, trauma that they both inflicted onto Black and Brown people and Indigenous communities, and upon themselves. And so, I fully am still in the process of learning and still in the process of growing, but I have really committed to that decolonization work using yoga, philosophy, and meditation, and pranayama, and the lifestyle as a way towards that liberation from suffering.
Thank you for sharing more about the work you do in the world. And as I was listening, I was thinking about grief and liberation. And often I think about the work that I do as grief work, even if it's not named that. So I would love to hear from you about why it's important to talk about grief and liberation now. Like, you just named liberation individually and collective, but why now, given what's going on in the culture?
Yeah, I think for me, what really catapulted this to a different level was the 2016 election. I had been dabbling in decolonization work prior to that, but there wasn't a sense of immediacy for me. Like, it was kind of like, oh, this is interesting, let me look into it. I would like to reclaim my roots. I would like to, not assimilate like I've been all these years. And so it was just like a little gradual process. But the 2016 election, along with some other events particularly for me, Philando Castile's murder was really impactful. And it just reminded me of how important it is to be committed to social justice. And so that year was, it was like, now there's a sense of immediacy for me. And so why now, I think also is because we've been under, at least in the US, we've been under an administration that has completely amplified the level of white supremacy that we have systemically, and not just on an individual level, or not just in the South. It's really everywhere. And it has really affected so many people, but it has really awoken so much in a lot of people as well, just as it did with me. And so there's this sense of like, gotta act, gotta do something, gotta figure this out. So I think that was really something that just kind of pushed everybody to have this sort of collective awakening. But that wasn't enough, right? And so we're still seeing how this shows up in daily life, daily interactions, specifically in the yoga studio for me, because that's where I spend most of my time, and that's where my career has been for the last 10 years. There is still a lot of like, yeah, we know this is happening, but we don't really know what to do, or we're not really sure what the right step is to move forward. Or yeah, we want diversity, but we're not necessarily sure how to make people feel included. Or, you know, there's just so much that happens in a person's brain, right? Human minds. So I think it's a perfect time for people of color who are willing to do this work to really step forward and do it in a way that is authentic and within integrity for us, and not do it for the white gaze, but really do it for that sense of like collective healing. We're going to be walking into spaces that are predominantly white. It's the world that we live in, right? And so while yes, we can choose to create our own spaces, and we should create our own spaces for ourselves, we still live in the real world. We can't always create that safe space for ourselves all the time. And so for me, it's very, very, very important that the people who are willing to do the work, who are white or white passing, do the work and do it correctly, and do it in a way that's actually going to stop the tokenization of Brown and Black people and Indigenous people, and also do it in a way where it's actually deep. It's not just a strategy. It's not just, oh, I have to bring in diversity so that I can look good on my website. But it's, you know, oh, now I understand bias. Oh, now I know what my blind spots are. Oh, now I get what tokenization actually is, so let me avoid that. And let me do everything I can to create racial equity, because that's important. So, you know, why now? There's so much, right? There's the internet, there's social media, there's so many ways to do the work now, and it's so much easier than it was before, that for me, it's like, there is no better time. Now is the perfect time. And, you know, 2020 is coming up. So we got to get everybody to do the right thing, right? And so, yeah, it's the perfect time to be doing this work.
Yeah, I appreciate what you shared about the election and how that shifted things for people, because I had the same experience of witnessing people awakening to things that have been present for a very long time. And also, I witnessed overwhelm in a way that felt different too, in people, their nervous systems, and feeling ungrounded and not knowing how to take action. And then you also named Philando Castile, and I think Trayvon Martin is the person for me that like cracked me open in this way, that I was in pieces on the floor. That's what it felt like. And so I think there are these moments happening culturally that really call us into paying attention to the gravity of what is happening. And I think Philando Castile is that moment, right, was a moment when people, I think, cracked open and didn't know what to do. And mindless action it's not really helpful.
Right.
And I think we do need space to, as you're naming, come together as folks of color, to heal, right? And you also name white folks need healing too. That work just is different because of how whiteness has been set up, or white supremacy has been set up.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about, because my experience of culture is that it doesn't make space for grief. And I think part of what you were just naming is the importance of grieving, and that's part of the work and the practice.
Mm-hmm.
What do you feel like it might look like for culture or us as people of color to prioritize space so that people can come into it and grieve and heal, like in order to heal, right? They're making space to grieve. What would that look like, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm also exploring duality as well. So, what does it look like for us to have that collective grieving, but then to also celebrate our joy and passion and laugh, and dance? Like, what does that look like also in a way that is respectful, and in a way that, isn't about, I don't know. There's just something about, yes, we need to grieve and we need to celebrate ourselves. And this was definitely something that came up recently in a talk that I did, a panel discussion where the audience members asked this question, and it was predominantly people of color in the audience, and they asked, yes, we need to work on suffering and what that does in the human body and what that does for the psyche in a system that is inherently oppressive. But then, do we need to focus on grief? Can we heal, and through that healing also celebrate ourselves and our uniqueness, and what makes us individuals? And so I think that when you start that healing process, when you really take a look at trauma in a much deeper level, and when you really take the time to work on where is the grief coming from, and how does it affect your life, how does it affect the way that you have relationships with people, and how does it affect the way that you teach, if you're a teacher or a leader or a consultant or a coach, how do all of these things show up in your life? When you choose to step into that, and it's super challenging, right? Like, grief is hard.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing to deal with. So many emotions are wrapped up in it. But I feel from experience that once I do that, my joy elevates so much more. I celebrate myself and my people so much more than I could have before, because I'm so stuck in the back of my mind. I have this thing, this grief behind me that I'm choosing not to see.
Right.
So I think, for people of color, it's so, so, so important that we really choose for ourselves, not for anybody else, but just for us, to really face what that grief looks like for us, whether it's sadness, depression. For me, it was alcohol. I was a binge alcoholic for a long time. And I really used alcohol as a way to suppress the things that I did not want to deal with. I did not want to face it. I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want, I didn't want to cry in front of people. Like, it was just, I'm going to go out, I'm going to have fun, I'm going to drink a lot, and I'm going to forget all about my problems, right? And for a long time, that grief was chasing me. It was right behind me the whole time. And as soon as I stopped drinking, it was right there. Yeah. And at some point, I had to figure that out, right? My body was sick. I couldn't handle it anymore. I was severely depressed. And so I had to take some time. And it was, for me, at least, it was yoga and meditation that led me towards, at least taking the baby steps to taking a look at what that grief looks like. And it has taken several years for me to really choose to not let grief overtake me, and to really deal with it and figure it out and move my body in a way that feels nourishing, so that I can cry when I need to cry and I can process when I need to process. And as a result of doing that, I am so, there's a sense of freedom. It's like weight off of my shoulders, right? When something good happens in my life, I can celebrate it, when, when I start noticing I've denied, my culture a little bit, right? I live in Los Angeles, so I'm not in Puerto Rico, and it's hard for me to like have that sense of like culture. But when I deal with my grief and I deal with that sense of like homesickness, and really take a look at it, I'm able to, reclaim my roots. And, I go out and I dance salsa and bachata, and I listen to Puerto Rican music, and, I connect with the Puerto Rican community here. And my joy is so much more elevated in that way. And that's how I show up on social media. And that's how I show up in my relationships. And then, when people come to me, whether they're friends or clients or whoever, when people come to me and they tell me, I'm having issues with this, or I'm having issues with that, I can tell from my own experience, oh, there's something there that they're not choosing to see, or they are seeing it, but they're choosing not to deal with it. And so, maybe we can just move them in the right direction, or I can give advice to my friends that will help them to find that sense of freedom for themselves. And, talking about freedom and liberation in this current system sometimes feels like an oxymoron a little bit, right? Because, it's the system, right? And so we're not inherently free, but you can find liberation in your own mind, and liberation can look different from person to person. And I think for me, a big catalyst to that, was Toni Morrison. She talked a lot about that sense of freedom for herself. Even though there might be somebody racist calling her a racial slur to her face, she knows that's not who she is. And she knows what that means about the other person. And so, she was a great example for me of what can it look like for an individual to really be liberated and free in their mind, and how to work your way up to that over time. So what that looks like collectively is all of us choosing to do that in a sense of community. And there's so much rooted in culture in that, at least for people of color, right? We used to come together in community. We used to live in community. We used to engage. We used to raise our children in community. We used to do ceremony and spiritual work and magic in community. And we've lost that. This is, white supremacy, it does not want that. Right. And so it's all about choosing to step away from that system and choose, yes, we are going to collectively come together and do this healing in a way that is as safe as possible, having as much leadership there that we can have to facilitate that healing, and be supported. I feel like this is a society that doesn't feel supported a lot of the time, and it's very real for a lot of us. It's very real. We don't feel supported. For me, what that looked like also in a yoga studio is I was choosing to go to a yoga class rather than just doing asana practice or pranayama practice at home, because I wanted to be surrounded by community. Right. But when I got to the studio, that wasn't necessarily the case, right? Everyone was their own little individual, their own little mat. And when I would place my mat down and say hello, they would move away from me, or, they would ask me questions about, my own practice. It's not a community experience most of the time. Unless that culture is cultivated in the studio by the management, by the owner, you're just walking into a cheap class, right? Or a cheaper class, because it's not expensive, but there's no sense of connection. And so what collective healing for me looks like is support, is nourishment, is, you know, allowing someone to cry when they need to cry and not questioning that, right? Giving them permission to do that, to fully express themselves. If they're angry, giving them the permission to be angry, and letting them talk that out. Sometimes people just need to say it out loud and get it out of their heads and not feel judged for that. And so what does it look like to be in a space where you're not going to be judged for the anger that you've been holding inside, or the depression, or, you know, just the sadness that comes with having to hold on to something, or that sense of frustration that you can't be yourself because you have to survive, or you can't be yourself because you might get fired from your job, or you can't speak up because of whatever, you know? So that's what it looks like for me, is like coming together and having everyone understand why it's important. And then also having everyone understand what true support looks like. And I know what it doesn't look like.
Right.
So I can at least speak to that. And then, you know, we figure it out together, right? That's what community is about. We figure it out together. We create that space. We could create that container and allow people to be themselves fully, unapologetically. And then we celebrate. We dance. We laugh. We do some magic. You know, we do some ceremony. And have that sense of collective respect and power, and really celebrate that collective power.
Yeah, I when you began to answer the question, you named duality and the like focus on grief, and also can we focus on resilience and joy, right? And celebrating, because we are resilient beings. And I'm wondering about if you can share a lesson that you learned from your experience of being with your grief, and a lesson that you learned from your experience of allowing joy, right? Because that's what the other thing you named that really struck me is, once you processed your grief, right, and grief is ongoing because life is in session, but once you processed grief, that it made more space for your joy, like there was expansion there. So yeah, I'd love to hear about a lesson from the process of grieving, and a lesson from having space for joy.
Yeah. For me, you know, with the grief, the lesson that I learn is how hard I am on myself. There are things that, yes, I can control, and there are a lot of things that I cannot control. They are beyond my, you know, everything, right? But what I have found is that in those moments where I don't necessarily have the control, or I don't know what's going to happen, or I can't predict another person's behavior or how they're going to treat me, I am very hard on myself in those moments. And especially after a situation happens, I am like in my head the whole time of like, should have said this, or what if I had done this? There's a lot of sense of self-worth that is not necessarily like a lack of confidence, but it's just, you know, it comes from, you know, being a child new to the United States. Is like, you know, why do you speak with an accent? Oh, there's something wrong with my language. I can't speak my language because there's something wrong with speaking differently, and therefore there's something wrong with me, right? And so all of that just carries on. So no matter what situation I'm in, that little voice in my head that is super, super hard on me always comes in and tries to take over. And when it does take over, there's so much work that I have to do around that, right? Like I really have to take the time to, you know, meditate, or, you know, read my sacred texts. I study Vedanta, so that's the lineage that I chose to follow. And so there's a lot of wisdom in those texts for me. And so, you know, sometimes it takes a book or two to set me
Right.
straight, right? And it takes hours and hours of meditation to set me straight, or asana practice, or pranayama practice, or going to the ashram, or going to temple, and getting myself to a place where I remember who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, I tend to be very hard on myself, and that adds to that sense of like, there's grief inside, there's sadness here. Um, and one of the things that I've learned around like reframing that for me is remembering how to pinpoint it. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not I am sad, it's sadness is in me.
Right.
And it's not, I am angry, it's there's anger inside. There's anger steeping, there's anger coming out. And that really helps. As simple as it might seem, and as like, it's not an easy thing to do in the moment.
Right.
But afterwards, when I can really take the time to, process things and figure it out, that's been really helpful. And I definitely learned that from Sadhguru is, I am not my body, I am not my mind. He has this whole meditation on that, which is beautiful. And that is something that I've definitely practiced whenever I am very hard on myself and that perfectionist comes out in me. I have to really take the time to remember, like, this is not who you are,
Right.
and really heal that inner child. And remember, there's sadness inside, but that's not who you are. And as a person that did deal with, a slight addiction to alcohol, and as a person that is in social settings, I take on energy. And I really soak it in, and I mold myself into the energy of the room, and I forget who I am. And so that has been a really helpful practice. And through that, the lesson that I learned in celebrating myself and my joy and my culture, that's been a big one, is really celebrating and being proud of my Puerto Rican heritage. And, celebrating my melanin, if we're honest, right? My brownness. What that has taught me is that, when I give myself permission to do that, I'm giving others permission to do that for themselves. And in turn, when I embody that sense of joy, and when I laugh, and when I dance, and when I show people how a human being can look like when they, have that dust off their shoulders,
Right.
And not in a like egotistical way, right? It's not a Kanye West type of thing, right? It's more so like, I'm alive, I'm human, I got the chance to be here and be in this moment in time, and how precious that is. I'm going to celebrate the hell out of that. And I am unique, I'm brown, I love that about myself. And when I fully embrace that, and when I fully embody that, the people around me change. The people around me also begin to do that for themselves. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. I live with my partner, who is a Black man, biracial man. And when I choose to celebrate myself, we're having a good time. We're having a good time. We're going to the beach. We're rollerblading outside, right? We're going dancing. We're going out salsa dancing, or we're going out. I no longer drink, but we're going out to the club and we're having a good time, right? It's that sense of like, how amazing is it to be us? How lucky are we to just be breathing right now? And that's what it's taught me, is that the power that an individual has to influence how somebody else can also celebrate themselves. That is so powerful. So yeah, those are definitely the lessons that I've learned, and I'm continuing to learn, because sometimes I forget who I am, and I never know when that's going to happen, right? Like, I will forget who I am, and I can always go back to celebrating myself.
Yeah, I love what you said about celebrating yourself, as a way to come back home to who you are, right? It's like, that's
Yeah.
a practice that you're naming, and the practice of remembering you're not your emotions. Emotions are present, right? So a sensation is present, or sadness is present, or as you mentioned, anger is present. You're not consumed by the sensations or emotions,
Right.
which, as you said, sounds simple, and it's not easy work to do at all. That, like, it sounds subtle, and it's really not. There can be a big shift that comes from that. And since I feel like you named a few practices, I want to ask about ritual or ceremony or practices that you've connected with to support you in both moving through grief and also this expansion and leaning into joy. What are some of the rituals and practices you engage in?
Yeah, so I'm in this really interesting place where, you know, I've been studying yoga and Vedanta for the better half of 10 years. And so I know that, you know, I practice some of the rituals there, and I go to ashram and I go to temple, and there are beautiful, beautiful practices there. But also in my journey towards reclaiming my own roots, I have found practices for my own people that I'm still learning, but due to erasure and colonization, it's harder. It has not been passed down as cleanly and as focused and as well written down and documented as some other cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been a little bit, you know, harder, but they're still there, you know, they survived. And so along with the yoga rituals that I have, there are, you know, there's a lot of magic and spirituality in, you know, Puerto Rican culture. So some of the things that I've reclaimed from there is we have a thing called Bomba y Plena in Puerto Rico. And so that is deeply rooted in both the indigenous and African ancestry that we have, heavily influenced by African culture. And so we get together in community. We could be in the street protesting, or we could be celebrating at a wedding. It doesn't matter. It looks exactly the same. And so, you know, there's drummers, it's several drummers, and people get in a circle and we sing. There's several different songs, many songs that we sing together. And then each person within the community goes into the middle of the circle, the drumming circle, and we dance to the drummer. So there's a dedicated drummer that is only for you. And then everybody else is just keeping the beat. And you and that drummer are fully connected. There's a unison between both of you. You dance, it's a freestyle. So you dance, and with your movement, the drummer hits the drum. So if I move my hand like this, he beats the drum. And if I, you know, do a little flick of the wrist, he does a little something on the drum. And it's this back and forth, and it's beautiful. And what that is meant to do is to remind you of the power of community, but also to remind you of the power of the individual. You can influence one person, but in that influence, there are so many people behind you supporting you and cheering you on. And so that is a ritual that we have in my culture. And it's a beautiful ritual. I love it. I used to study it when I was younger before we moved to the United States. And I still remember it vividly. So that's something that I found a community that does that here. And anytime I get to do that, I'm there for it. But individually, like in my house, in my own home, there are several different ancestral spiritual tools that I have, like having an ancestral altar and speaking, you know, to spirit, and, you know, having rituals like, you know, writing down messages on bay leaves, burning them when, you know, I either want them to go out into the universe or I'm trying to let something go. And then having a ritual around water and ashes and fire and air elements. So, there's many different things that I'm learning along the way. But, my yoga practice, helps me in one way, and embodying and getting into my body, and having that sense of connection and unification with divinity and the universe and all of that. And then my own culture and my own, spiritual roots allows me to, continue to reclaim and reconnect and have a relationship with my ancestors, whether I knew them or not, whether I can see their faces or I don't. And what I'm finding is when I do that, I can feel spirit healing as well. And I can feel my ancestors healing through me as well. When I heal, my ancestors are healing as well. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Thank you for sharing some about the rituals and practices, and also practices specific to your cultural background, right, and where you're from. And I want to say, because I don't know who will be listening to these, that I'm going to ask people to share their practices, the people I'm interviewing, and these are not practices that folks need to take on, right, without any understanding of them. So now I'm just naming cultural appropriation. So if listeners are hearing practices that sound interesting or you're curious about, be mindful of where they're from and your relationship to that culture. Feels important to name that based on what you just shared with us. And the other thing that struck me in the description of the drummer and movement and connection and was that I think grieving is about moving energy. And that's part of what I heard that happens in that ritual. And it makes me think about the duality you were talking about. There's like clearing out energy, moving energy, then to expand into joy, which is part of what you named earlier. And it's just a different way to think about grief, because sometimes people think about grieving as crying, right? Or a deep depression. And sometimes, I mean, there is sadness connected to the process of grieving something we've lost or someone we've lost. Or an experience, right, that's not available to us or that has passed. So I love this idea of grieving being like an active thing we do, and that it really is about movement. And if it's not physical movement, that energy is moving. And that's what I heard. So we can make space to come home to ourselves, to feel joy, right? To find stillness and quiet, to go inside. There are all these different things that happen from moving energy. And what's inherent in that is acknowledging that something's there and needs to be moved, right? And we can't individually or collectively lean into that joy or the expansion or spaciousness that's available or the new ways of being unless we acknowledge history and where we're from and how we came to be. And we move through that, and we can't bypass it.
Exactly. Yeah, the first step is always to acknowledge that something is even there, something's happening, something's moving, something's agitated, something is fiery. And then in that acknowledgement, allowing it to move, allowing it to pass. Sometimes that looks like tears. Sometimes that looks like laughter. Sometimes that looks like dance. Sometimes that looks like punching a pillow. But whatever it chooses to manifest as, allowing that to happen, I think is super, super important. Otherwise, you're just suppressing everything. Like I mentioned, like, drinking was my choice of suppression. So I would go out, I would drink, and I wouldn't have to deal with whatever was trying to move out of me. And that's harmful. It was really harmful. It was a form of like self-medication, but it wasn't medicine at all, and there's a difference between a medicine that helps you and a medicine that keeps you sick.
Yeah, that's so powerful, what you just named about medicine and how we use it. And I think there's so much that in dominant culture that distracts us from remembering the medicine we need or the medicine that's available to us when we connect to ancestors or culture. And I want to just spend a little time talking about the retreat that's coming up in June. So Constanza Eliana and I, plus 4 other facilitators, are going to be holding space in Asheville the second weekend of June. I think it's June 11th through 14th at Om Sanctuary. And Constanza Eliana agreed to be one of the co-facilitators for this. And it really is a space where we're going to look at grief individually and collectively and create space for liberation. And we'll do that in different ways. So I would love for you just to let us know what made you say yes to this, right? Because it feels like it's unique. It's a unique offering. So what made you say yes to co-facilitating it?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I recently shared early this morning. I was scrolling the Instagram and I was searching the yoga retreat hashtag just to see what's out there, what's happening. How is a yoga retreat being marketed, or how is it, being shown to people? So I typed in the hashtag. And I was scrolling, and all I saw were individuals, predominantly white. I want to say like 90% of them were white, women at that. And, doing very fancy poses on a beach or in a tropical setting or in India. And I saw no group of people together in circle, in community, or chatting with each other. There was none of that. And so scrolling, still don't see it. And I'm thinking to myself, this is why this retreat is needed. We are an industry, the yoga industry is an industry that is heavily influenced by capitalism. And part of that capitalism is to market whatever retreat or workshop or class it is that you're giving, to market yourself as the expert. And in doing that, marketing yourself as the expert, you are unconsciously or even perhaps consciously perpetuating this idea that only people who look like you are allowed to do this practice, or are allowed, to step into, a retreat experience. There's also a lot of luxury in the retreat, yoga retreat space. And it's not that luxury doesn't have its own place, but that's not the only people who deserve a retreat experience, right? A retreat is not necessarily a vacation. A retreat is to get you out of your daily routine and your daily grind so that you can have an experience that releases any of the muck that has been created through that daily grind. You can release that and reset. So when you come back to your daily life, you have this new sense of freedom. And it's kind of like a detox, right? Scientifically, right? Like what scientifically a detox is meant to do is reset the system so that when you've created this new, fresh start, it's not all that muck that has lingered, right? And so that's what a retreat experience is meant to do for you. And that's not what I was seeing. And I, again, I've been in the yoga industry for 10 years, and I've never heard of a retreat where the express intention was to come together and heal and pass the grief through. And then through that, have a sense of celebration of like, hey, we did it, like we got through this, and now it's time to celebrate our humanness, and it's time to celebrate our individuality. That's not what's being marketed out there. So when I got, the invitation from you, and you were so clear on what you wanted to have, I was like, yeah, let's do it, because it's necessary. And like I said, we're heading into 2020.
Right.
And do we really want to keep perpetuating the same old stuff in this new year and the following, 50 years, right? Like, do we really want this same old to continue happening? I hope not. And so it was really important for me that, whenever an invitation comes through and it feels in alignment, that I fully step in with, my own sense of integrity, but bring in the tools that I can to help facilitate a space that is truly nurturing and healing for everybody involved. And if I feel like I can do that, then, I definitely will. So that's why I chose to say yes to you. And also just, through my mentorship with you, I've gained so much that I know that your intention is always to celebrate people and humans and to guide them in a way that is respectful and also in a way that challenges them in all the right ways. So I just trusted that, your vision and you, and however I can, bring in my tools, then yeah, it was a hell yes.
I'm glad that it was a hell yes. I'm so glad you're co-facilitating and going to hold space, and that we'll be in space together. And I would love for you to share some of what's coming up for you and what you're doing, like workshops that are coming up. And of course, I'll include this on the webpage as well. But is there anything you want to share that you're doing that you want to invite listeners to? People watching?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So much. Feels like every day something else is coming through, a new opportunity, which is great. What's coming up for me right now is I'm doing more things in person in Los Angeles. So I'm not teaching at a studio, but I am doing workshops and pop-up classes. So if anyone is in Los Angeles, they can just look me up on Instagram and be able to find the events that I'm doing locally. There's one coming up in December, right before the holiday starts, that is all about community. There's going to be, me facilitating the yoga experience, which includes asana, pranayama, and meditation. And there will also be music, really nourishing music. There's a cafe there, so we'll have a chance to connect and interact and have a conversation as well. So that's coming up. That's at Cafe Om on December 12th. And then aside from, some pop-up things also happening in 2020, I am facilitating my first mastermind for yoga teachers of color. And yoga practitioners of color who are wanting to step into a leadership role. So it's called Thriving Yogi. It's an online mastermind. It's a 16-week program where I will have other guest teachers of color who are thriving in the system, and also, taking up space in the ways that they feel like they can, and then also creating a sense of community for our own. And so that's happening in January of 2020. So I'm currently taking applications for that. And I do have a scholarship fund that I'm currently raising for either partial scholarships or a full scholarship for someone who really deserves it. So if anyone is interested in that, you do have to be Black, Indigenous, or a person of color in order to apply. But that is going to start in January 2020. And then I'm also traveling, doing workshops. So I'm actively taking inquiries from either yoga studios or yoga teachers who want to facilitate either unpacking spiritual bypass workshop at their studio space, or an body inclusivity signature training, so that I can continue doing this work. So yeah, lots happening.
I know that is a lot. Big things happening coming up. to end out 2019 and to move into 2020.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining me today and exploring the things we talked about and just sharing in such a deep and vulnerable way. I really appreciate everything you shared and appreciate who you are in the world. And I'm glad you're in the world doing the work that you're doing, right? And modeling for other people what this practice could look like. So thank you for being here, Constanza Eliana. And,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.